He slid the ring onto the other woman's finger as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world. Cameras exploded, glass chandeliers trembled with the sound of shutters. 1,000 polite smiles froze into something cruel. The hand that had once promised forever rested on a stranger's wrist with the cold certainty of a verdict. Sue Manning stood on a stage that was supposed to celebrate a union and felt her life compress into the hollow between one flash and the next. The ring, bright, heavy, unmistakably his, caught the light and cut her reflection into pieces. Around her, silverware clinked, champagne sighed in crystal, and someone laughed a little too loud to cover the whisper that spread like a stain. Shame. It was meant to be a charity night, gilded and polished, where donors gave with pomp and the city's well-born paraded virtue under the chandeliers. Instead, the spectacle became a slow bruise. The man who had led Sue there, Ting Shen, heir to the Shen fortune, the man whose family name opened doors, chose that stage to mark a different kind of claim. He watched the ring settle on the mistress's finger and did not look at Sue as he did it. He watched the cameras. The woman who received the ring smiled in a way that made the room tilt. Her dress was the kind of wrong beige that made people notice, her hair cut to catch light like a lure. Yamin Soo-young had climbed dinner tables and rumor mills for years, stepping exactly where she needed to with the confidence of someone who believed things were owed to her. Tonight, she had been given the prize. The photograph would say everything the artists of gossip could not. Power transferred via metal band. Dignity unthreaded with a blink. A video looped within minutes. The ring, the smile, the look of a woman left standing in a dress that suddenly felt too thin. Social feeds took the scene and magnified it. Commentary sprouted like mold. Public divorce, one headline declared. Shocking betrayal at charity gala, another. Someone cropped the moment and wrote in red across the bottom. The truth revealed. Sue had come that night with hope that looked like a strict professional restraint. She wore a simple dress, had pulled back her dark hair into a knot, and had agreed to a photograph for the cause, a small thing that became the evidence at the center of a storm. She wanted once to believe that the rumor mills were wrong, that the supposed tensions with Ting were a grotesque exaggeration. That belief died in the seconds between the ring and the flash. Later, when the footage rewound and froze on her face in the moment, she understood how public humiliation could finish the work of 1,000 private humiliations. Her family's phones began to ring the instant the first clip went viral. Her father's voice, usually measured, became brittle. Calls from old acquaintances, from a niece who wanted to know what was happening, from a neighbor who thought better of her after seeing the video. Each one was another small crack. You should apologize, her uncle told her the next morning, for the sake of the family, for appearances. The elder cousin, who had always believed in alliances rather than loyalty, insisted she go on camera and grovel. But apologies would not erase the image that had already taken up residence in people's heads. A ring on the wrong finger, proof of misplaced trust. Apologies, the family believed, would be a way to stitch the torn cloth, but the cloth had already been cut. Their priority was containment, spin, contrition, damage control. Sue's priority was different. She wanted to know how a private promise had become a public weapon. She left the party with Hung at her shoulder. Hung, who had worked for her father as a bodyguard, and now stayed beyond his remit because of old debts, or maybe out of genuine stubborn loyalty. He walked close enough to be a shield, and far enough to respect her independence. He wore a dark coat and a face that had learned to say nothing when people tried to bully with words. He did not smile that night. He did not need to. He could make a room feel safer by simply standing in it. The first days were a crush of small cruelties. Invitations stopped arriving. Clients at the clinic began to cancel appointments under the rumor that Sue's personal life bled into her professional judgment. Not because they believed it, because judge, jury, and court of big city gossip often act without deliberation. Her email filled with questions that never had answers. A local paper printed an op-ed that suggested her marriage was a sham, and someone from the Shin circle leaked a staged photograph. Ting and Yamin, in an apparently intimate posture, captured and polished for circulation. The oddest pressure came from inside her circle. Her mother, Ruth Manning, called with a voice too soft to carry anything like advice. "We should be careful," she said. We should think of Stella's school, the donations, the board. Ruth's sentences always ended like that now. Practical, fearful, hardscrabble, because fear rearranged the grammar of her speech. Sue could hear the small cache of fear in her mother's words. The family had bills and weeds, and debts that weren't spoken in front of visitors. A scandal could be a match in a dry field. Sue's own instincts moved differently. She worked with bodies for a living. She could read bruises beneath skin that other people called mere marks. She knew about the languid oddities in prescriptions, the way a chart could be doctored if someone had the time and dexterity to arrange it. In college, she had been surgical at night and clinical at day. She kept her hands steady because they had learned to be steady. That steadiness now became a resource. The first clue was small and almost comical. A takeout bowl left on the back seat of her car, the lid tucked uneasily into the floor mat. It smelled faintly of the restaurant that catered the gala, gingery stock and scallion oil. Someone had tried to care for appearances by leaving a trace of domestic normality in her vehicle, as if she might salvage a life where meals still arrived intact. Hung noticed it. "Waste not," he said, voice low. He liked to make a joke when the mood cratered. Sue did not laugh. She opened the lid and tasted the broth, carefully, the way a person tests something they might not trust. It was savory and dull, like soup that had been held too long. The taste lodged behind her teeth like a question. Why would someone leave a bowl in her car? To comfort her? To stage a photo op? Or as a message, "We can touch what you think belongs only to you"? The soup became a motif in her mind. Nurture turned suspect, nourishment contaminated by manipulation. She remembered the way her mother used to make broth when Sue was a child, clear and healing, a thing to put on the table when days felt unmanageable. Now a bowl signaled something else, a performance, an accusation, a proof. She started keeping careful records, names, times, voices. She began to watch the Shen family with a physician's attention, pulse in the throat, contradiction in the eyes. There was Mrs. Shen, the matriarch, who wore the kind of smile that was at once gracious and a measurement of worth. There was Ting's junior cousin, who wore ambition like a strap-on accessory, always leaning in, always present in photos, unobtrusive until you noticed. Yam and Suyang glided through rooms as if rooms themselves owed her comfort. "Don't," Ruth said when Sue spoke aloud about digging. "We need an end to it." "Who else will find the end?" Sue asked. Her voice had the rawness of someone who had been wronged and decided to name it. It was not only the scandal that forced her hand. Behind the noise, a quieter, more dangerous thing was threading itself into their lives. Ting had been at the center of something more fragile than a marriage. A year before, the car crash had looked like an accident. Investigations fizzled. Documentation arrived half complete. Someone very practiced in the art of arrangement, had smoothed over inconvenient details. The estate that should have supported Ruth and Sue had been restructured with linguistic cleverness. Contracts, when read in a room of lawyers, folded into neat, unreadable lines. Sue had learned to read those lines once. She had been set aside then. That old bruise had never fully healed. After the gala, its edges opened again. Sue began to suspect that the public humiliation was not an isolated cruelty, but part of a larger architecture. Discredit her, marginalize her, make sure nobody would look too closely at the old accident, the missing paperwork, the questions about custody and domicile. If she was reduced to a spectacle, then her voice could be dismissed as shrill. If she were made to look unstable, if she were the woman everyone whispered about, then her claims to any family asset might rot away in public contempt. She could have retreated. She could have let the rumor kill quiet things and kept her mother's name off front pages. Instead, she did what she knew how to do. She prepared to look, to find, to prove. At the clinic, Sue worked at the edge of downtown. The waiting room was dim, and the coffee always tasted like it had been reheated too many times. Her colleagues had been brief with their sympathies. Dr. Dean, a man who wore his compassion like a cardigan, stayed close, offering small kindnesses, a detail noted in casebooks. He was the sort of person who would notice a misfiled chart. It was Dr. Dean who found the slight discrepancy in the admission records for the night of Ting's earlier accident. A nurse's initials that didn't match the roster and a time that was shifted by 37 minutes. It could have been a clerical error. It could have been an opening. You know what people do when they want to make a truth unreadable? Dr. Dean said over a stale cup of coffee, tapping a pen against the margin of a file. They change the paper, they change the names, they change the timestamps, but they don't always make the errors consistent. They rush. People who orchestrate these things are human. Sue looked at the ink and felt the old ache. That part of her trained to trust data and to distrust stories told by people in expensive suits. She also recognized the fingerprints of craftsmanship, a long job, not something haphazard. Someone who wanted power had prepared the scaffolding to make that power appear legitimate. Hung's loyalty had other edges. He had worked for the Shens for years. He knew the doors, the angles, the servants who might have overlooked something in exchange for a small kindness. He made calls no one recorded. He knocked on doors without announcing himself. His loyalty to Sue belonged to a past debt he had long repaid, a night in which Sue's father had kept him from prison with a handshake. He wore that debt like armor. The first direct pushback came in a medium that was as modern as it was merciless. A blog post with a photograph of Sue at a hospital bed, hand between the slats of a poultry crib, her expression unreadable. The caption suggested she was negligent. It spun a story of a woman who could not keep her professional life separate from her personal chaos. A plastic surgeon who had once been an admirer for reasons that had nothing to do with admiration, he had seen her as a rising star, then watched the rumor mill eat her, wrote a letter to the board questioning her fitness. More troubling than the letter was the quiet interruption, a late-night call from Dr. Dean, voice clipped. "Someone's been in the records room," he said. "Tonight, after hours." Files moved. Sue's stomach tightened. She heard the familiar shift. When a house is being raided by rumor, paper is where they start. If documents could be tampered with, a court could be misled. A judge cannot act on what is missing. They went to the records room together, Hung and Sue and Dr. Dean, the hallway smelling of bleach and midnight. The room was a square of fluorescent light in which things lost their softness. Someone had rifled through files with purpose. Paper lay like snowdrifts on the floor. A single folder had been torn, edges ragged, like a mouth chewed at. "You know it'll look worse when the paper is missing," Dr. Dean said. His hands were steady as he gathered the shards. "They will say incomplete, and the incomplete will hide intent." "She can't do this forever," Sue said. Her voice was 3 parts fury and 1 part exhaustion. "They can't keep erasing." "You think they will stop if you do nothing?" Hung asked, always practical, always the shield. "It's not about them stopping," Sue said. "It's about making sure the truth still exists, even if they try to burn it." She folded the remaining documents carefully, as if the right crease could conjure legality. That night, when she slept, she dreamed of a basement. Her mother's voice echoed from behind a closed door, muffled and sweet. In the dream, Sue found a key with the Shen emblem and a piece of paper with a name she didn't expect. She woke with her heart stuttering and a taste of iron at the back of her throat. Dreams, she knew, were sometimes the mind's way of telling the body where to look. The next morning, a video surfaced of Ting Shen leaving the gala with Yamin on his arm. He looked like a man who had finally decided what he wanted. She looked like a conqueror who had just taken a small coastal village. The comments were relentless. "Gold digger," someone wrote under her photo. "Home wrecker," another said. The feed swarmed. For every supportive voice there were 20 that were gleeful and vicious. In the privacy of her office, Sue pulled patient charts and legal documents and cross-checked names. She had friends in low places and acquaintances in high ones. She began to assemble a map. Who had motive? Who had access? Who had something to gain if she was cut away from an inheritance she barely understood? The list was long. The Shin family's pattern of quiet accumulation had always left her and her mother on the periphery, items in a ledger. If they could make her the scandal, they could litigate her rights away with public perception as the battering ram. But motives are not proof. Sue needed proof. Her first ally outside the family was small and unlikely. May, the night manager of a modest restaurant that catered the gala. May had known Sue since childhood. Their families had shared holidays when money did not separate people the way it did now. May drank no wine at charity events. She drank too much of the work behind the scenes, orders, deliveries, the gossip that cooks up in kitchen heat. May's memory was a map of the kitchen's rhythm. "Delivery came early," May told Sue in a whisper when they met behind the restaurant's stacked crates. A box labeled donation. Someone moved it out of the prep counter. The dish came back with a lid snapped on a little too tight. They always used silver chafing dishes. Someone switched it with a disposable pan. Sue's throat went dry. The word switched was a small possibility that could have monstrous consequences. It was the kind of small human act, the careless hand, the moment of distraction that could never be fully controlled if you were looking. If you think there was tampering, you should record the staff list that night, May continued. There were 3 temps. The same 2 who worked the coat check were seen talking to a woman in beige. She had a ring. That ring, Sue thought. Her mind tightened on the image, the ring sliding on another's finger while cameras flashed. She had not been the only one to see the move. Someone had the means to make people watch as the scene unfolded. Someone had provided the props. Hung did the legwork on the shin end. He found a name that looked like an afterthought in the ledger, a consulting firm that had been paid under the description Event Logistics. The firm's contract included a line about guest experience management, and the contact listed was an agency that often hired temps for high society events. The trail led to a doorway that swung open when you pushed it, a security guard who had signed timesheets, and a florist who remembered seeing Yamin in a private corner of the room. Meanwhile, Sue followed medical threads. She thought of Ting as someone who had never been neat with his life or his promises. He was handsome in a lazy way. His family had taught him to expect acquiescence. She could not imagine him orchestrating a scandal that required precise timing across staff and security unless someone else had arranged it for him. Or perhaps he had been coached. Perhaps he had been placed in the role of a public villain without being offered the choices that actors sometimes think they have. Her skepticism hardened into the conclusion that someone in the Shin circle wanted the optics of betrayal. The optics would be enough to send a whisper of doubt into the legal world and the social ledger. All that was needed was a picture and someone to narrate it. On the 3rd day, a note arrived slipped under the clinic door. It was a scrap of paper with an address and a time and a single line. "We need to talk." The handwriting was rushed, as if someone had written in a hurry and not wanted to be seen. Such notes, Sue knew, were rarely casual. She went, with Hung waiting like a shadow at her back. The address was an old storage warehouse near the river, its windows blank with dust. Inside, under a single dangling light bulb, a man she vaguely recognized from hospital staff stood waiting, an orderly whose name had surfaced in May's recollection of temps. He looked small and frightened, as if he had come for confession rather than courage. "Why are you here?" Sue asked. He swallowed. "They told me to be with the coats," he said. "They said make sure one woman left early. They said—" He stopped, the sentence collapsing into a thud. "Who told you?" Hung asked. He did not yet raise his voice. He had learned there was a difference between interrogation and breaking someone's spirit. "Names now," the man breathed. "A man in a gray suit. He had a voice like he'd been behind a podium. He showed me papers. He said the night was prearranged. He said—" His hands trembled as he fumbled for a cell phone. He pulled up a photograph and showed it to Sue. A backlit image of the coat check, a hand exchanging something small and bright. In the glow, the small object looked like a ring. "You saw her hand?" Sue asked. "Yes." He looked at her, as if pleading that she understand how little he had and how big his fear was. "She had a yellow dress when I saw her, beige, and a ring came out of a small velvet box. He guided Ting to do it. He told Ting he had to make a point. He said the cameras would help." The warehouse light hummed as if it too were waiting to exhale. The man's confession was not the whole conspiracy. It was, however, enough to shift the problem from a rumor to something with a trail. Enough to say someone had planned the optics. Sue held that photograph in her palm and felt the gravity of it. Someone had engineered her public ruin. Someone had used a man, Ting, and a woman, Yamin, and a room full of illustrious people to create a narrative. The question she could not yet answer was, why? Why did they need to erase her from the ledger? Whose benefit bloomed in that erasure? The man in the warehouse offered another fragment. They said her mother lived alone, that someone would say she wasn't fit, and then the social pages would say it too. He spoke as if repeating a script he could not change. That night, Sue went home and found Ruth standing at the sink, the light over the faucet making her mother look as if she were cut from some raw, honest cloth. I don't want the girls to see any of this, Ruth said, voice stripped of the brittleness that had entered it earlier. You mean you don't want Stella to see her grandmother's name in ink? Sue asked. Stella was Ruth's granddaughter, small, quick, a child who still thought Sunday meals were the universe. Ruth shook her head. We'll move. We will be careful. Her eyes flicked to a box on the counter, one she had tried to hide. It's better if we leave. Sue looked at the box. Inside were letters, brittle and folded. Sue knew, had known for some time, that their family history was a patchwork of favors and debts. She also knew that leaving could mean abandoning the only record of what she might later need. I'm not going anywhere, she said, not without the truth. Ruth's hand tightened around the dish towel like a prayer. There are things you do not understand, she whispered. They are older than both of us. Sue wanted to answer that some truths could be forced into daylight. She wanted to believe that evidence and tenacity could outmatch a family's history of quiet violence. What she could not say aloud was that she had been choosing the wrong battles for a long time. She had hoped that dignity would be enough. Dignity was not a shield against an engineered photograph. The next morning, as she was going through files, there was a knock at the door. Hung answered and let in a woman with paper eyes and a voice like a closed window. It was Mina, the Shen family lawyer she had met once at an event. Mina's smile was polite to a fault. You should not be here, Mina said, folding her hands with the effectiveness of someone who worked with documents instead of people. This will complicate the estate matters. Sue felt the old things tighten. Contracts, heirlooms, a ledger that could be read to exclude or include. What estate matters? She asked. Mina's gaze flicked to Hung. The Shens are arranging things, for the good of everyone. For the good of everyone? Sue repeated. The phrase sounded like a lid being screwed on. You mean for the good of those who already own everything? Mina's image did not change. You should accept the apology if offered, she said, voice gentle and strong. You should accept the charity. Charity doesn't buy back what they took, Sue said. You know that. Mina left with a polite pat on the air. The conversation would be recorded in a ledger somewhere, a professional warning issued with the bloom of compassion. It would be cited by others as evidence of reason. Sue learned to read those little exchanges like Braille. She learned nimble law's language, apparent kindness used as a lock. If she wanted to retrieve anything, she would have to play at the margins where paper was not yet firm, where the crust of civility was still fragile. The pattern became clear over the next week. Rumors increased. So did the number of people willing to speak in whispers and the number of files that were not where they should be. Someone had culled a small library of information. Someone else had left a trail of minor proofs to a dozen people who would never gather them into a single thread. Sue gathered threads small as they were. Hung found a security guard who admitted to having been told to keep an eye on a woman in beige. May produced the kitchen schedule and a photograph of the disposable pan. Dr. Dean had recorded a discrepancy in a chart. The warehouse man had offered a photograph. Each fragment felt like a splinter. Put the splinters together and they might pierce the armor of the Shins. But splinters do not bring down an empire. When Ting Shen did not call to apologize, when he did not message, when he did not offer the usual patronizing concern, people began to assume he had chosen Yamen. That assumption was part of the play. It took no small courage to separate what a man chose from what a family engineered. Sue kept waiting for him to step into what she thought was guilt and clarify, but his silence became the loudest testimony in the room. Then came the call from the hospital. The voice on the line was clipped, professional. Mr. Shen has been brought in, the operator said. Motor vehicle accident. He's stable but unconscious. Sue felt the floor tilt like a ship. An accident. The accident connected back like a seam through the years. The words motor vehicle wrote themselves like a harbinger. For a moment, even with the scandal fresh at her heels, the rest of the world reduced to a narrow tunnel. At the clinic, in the dim corner where she kept her coffee and the pile of unfiled patient charts, Sue sat down and let herself imagine. She pictured a car, the way metal crumples, the way glass scatters like stars. She thought of Ting, who had used spectacle like currency. She thought of the ring and the photograph that had made her small. She thought of the way an accident can rewrite history. Her hands trembled as if with a fever. Hung moved before she could. He called in favors, pressed buttons, used the quiet contract between debt and gratitude to get her into a visitation room. The hospital smelled the way hospitals do at night, antiseptic, and the faint sweetness of something small and human. Machines hummed like bees. A monitor made a careful, indifferent sound. Ting lay in the bed like a man who had been hollowed out. There were no dramatic wounds visible. There was, instead, a pressing, careful stillness. Tubes ran like clear answers to questions Sue did not yet possess. His cheek was an ashen map. His hands were still and devoid of the gestures they used to practice to charm rooms. Someone had suggested he had been driving himself. Someone else had said a delivery driver had sideswiped his car. The rumor machine always prefers a simple cause. Simplicity cleared the path for new narratives. For Sue, this was the moment of cognitive dissonance, public humiliation, then a hospital bed. Behind her, threads of possibility unfurled. In front of her, the need to find them before they were cut. She kept watch at the door of the ICU. The nurse on duty moved like someone who had learned to keep distance from drama. Dr. Dean arrived with a photograph in his hand, a snapshot of a scene that belonged to a year ago, but the photograph had been re-examined and new insights had been noted. "We missed this before," he told her. A detail on the steering column was not consistent with the model of his car. There may have been interference. Sue nodded. Interference had been the word of the year, applied to relationships, to documents, to social life. We could apply it to machines too, if we were willing to watch and to notice. She walked to the bedside and placed a hand on Ting's wrist. He was cool and steady. His pulse was present, but distant, like someone who had retreated behind a glass wall. "He can't have done that to himself," she said, not to the room, but to the quiet that lived inside it. "You don't know what he can do," Dr. Dean replied. He did not say it as condemnation as he did as a fact. People are complex. People are capable. The hospital felt like a room where complexity was confessed. As she left, Sue thought of the ring on Yaman's finger, of a staged moment, and then of Ting unconscious, his bones arranged into a drama she could not yet read. Her mind telegraphed possibilities. A planned collapse, a planned accident, or perhaps the retaliation of some messy inner life. None of it made sense without more proof. Outside the hospital, the city was bright and indifferent. A pigeon hopped along a gutter and pecked at a crumb. Tonal light washed the buildings yellow. Life continued in its casual disregard for private catastrophes. Sue's phone buzzed with a single message, a photograph of a small old key and a line that said, "Basement. Find it. Don't tell them you have it." The message had no signature. It wore no face. It came with the humility of someone who had decided risk was less deadly than silence. Sue held the photograph and felt the world narrow again to one bright instrument. A key is a very ordinary thing. It fits in a palm and opens a lock. In the photograph, the key had an emblem she half recognized, the Shen crest, small and ornate, the kind of mark that could be stamped into a ledger. Her fingers twisted around the phone. Who had sent it? Who dared to ask her to look behind the house where civility kept its best china? There are moments when a person chooses to step through a threshold. For Sue, choosing meant deciding that dignity alone would not be enough. The scandal had midnight threads that led into basements and storerooms and quiet offices. If the key fit a lock, it might fit a story. If it fit a story, the story might unthread the purpose of the ring. She did not sleep much that night. The city sang on, the world kept its rhythms, coffee carts, subway doors, morning shows, and the scandal kept blooming on feeds with memes and reactions. She made herself a small meal at 3 a.m, the broth tasting of a memory that was not hers. She rinsed the bowl carefully because old habits are a kind of prayer. When she went back to the clinic in the morning, Dr. Dean was waiting at her desk with a folder and a look that meant he had risked something to bring her a piece of truth. "I pulled 5 more files," he said. "You need to see them." Sue sat down and extended a hand to accept. She felt the weight of the morning in the way the light caught the dust motes by the window. Their small room with its coffee-stained mugs became a confessional. Charts unfolded like maps. Names bled through in neat cursive. There were gaps and a single torn corner where a document used to be. There was also, beneath one of the margins, a number that did not belong in a ledger. An account routed through an offshore consultancy. You know how these work, Dr. Dean said. You follow the money, you follow the people who facilitate the lie. Sometimes the people who arrange optics make sure to keep providers quiet. In this case, someone paid. In this case, the same firm that organized the gala's guest experience appears on a payment that coincides with the day the original car crash happened. Sue felt the long, cold slide of recognition. The two threads, public spectacle and private accident, were marching toward the same truth. She could not, by force of will, make people see the pixels she saw on paper. She could only begin to assemble the pieces in a way that made sense to a court, to a journalist with a spine, or to a judge who still believed in pattern. "You're going to open a hornet's nest," Hung warned. He leaned back in his chair and watched Sue like someone who had seen storms and learned which windows to bolt. "She already stung me," she said. "It's my nest." The pieces were not yet enough to act on. They were, however, enough to form a plan. Sue arranged a small team of people who owed her nothing and risked everything by simply staying in her orbit. Dr. Dean, who could interpret medical anomalies. May, who could track kitchen staff. Hung, who would watch the Shin's perimeters. And a young paralegal named Clara, who worked for a firm that handled family foundations and who owed Sue a favor for saving her mother years earlier. They met in the back room of the restaurant where the air was thick with oil and the sound of pans. The smell of scallions was honest and disarming. They spoke in low voices and traced a map on a napkin. Who had been at the gala, who had access to the kitchen, who had motive to remove Sue from the ledger. "We'll be careful," Clara said, tapping each name. "We'll collect evidence. We won't do anything illegal." Sue nodded. The injunction was both ethical and strategic. They had to act within the law because the law was the place where papers could bite back. "We do not do anything we would not want reproduced on page 1, Dr. Dean said. "That is our guiding principle." They set out a timeline of small legal actions, requests for logs, interviews with temps, demands for CCTV footage. The strategy was granular. Collect the temps' contracts, subpoena the event planner's payments, have an independent lab analyze the soup remaining from the catering. The lab would not test for harmful substances without a chain of custody, and they had to follow that chain. It was slow. It was tedious. It was truth in the making. But truth, finally, is often a long assembly of patient moves. It is small acts performed repeatedly until they form a pattern that is undeniable. They began to notice a shape. A small group within the Shin network, event staff, a security consultant, someone at the logistics firm had coordinated the moment. Someone had orchestrated that image. Someone had insisted on the optics because the optics serve a ledger. On the 4th day of their quiet investigation, Sue received a photograph that stopped her breath. It was a still of the gala taken from a camera angle that had not yet been public. In the background, near the edge of a mirrored column, a man in a gray suit looked back over his shoulder at the stage. He was not in the glamour shots. He was not in the cleaned-up photos the Shins offered to the press. He was in a place a man with knowledge would be, an operations seat, not a social one. The man's profile was not a thing Sue knew by name, but his posture was the posture of someone whose hands pull strings. At the bottom of the photo, someone had scrawled 3 words, "Check the basement." Sue's heart kicked. The word basement remembered her dream. It remembered the note with the key. It turned the small puzzle into something urgent. If a basement existed, and if someone had used it to hold a truth out of sight, then the key might be the hinge that opened everything. She held the photograph until her fingers went numb. The Shin crest on the metal was too small to be seen without leaning close, ornate enough to be a family mark, not a trinket. It belonged behind a door, or in a drawer, not in the pocket of someone who'd slipped it under a clinic door with a single brusque line. Whoever had left it wanted her to move. "Check the basement," she read again, aloud this time, and the words landed like commands. They met that afternoon under the false intimacy of a takeout table in May's back room. The group had grown careful rituals. Who arrived by which door, which names to use on the phone. The light there was forgiving. The noise of the kitchen made conspiracies sound natural. Sue laid the key in the center of the table as if it were a relic. Clara, who had a way of making legal possibilities sound like tools rather than fantasies, traced the crest with a fingertip. "That's company property marking," she said. "You don't stamp keys like that unless you want them identified as assets." Dr. Dean pushed his glasses up and said, "If it's Shen property, we need a lawful search. Evidence the police can take, chain of custody clean. If we simply go in, we risk a judge dismissing everything we find." "There are ways to get a warrant," Hung said. He always used fewer words than his presence implied. "If we have witness testimony that a person is being detained against their will." He stopped, felt the edge of the statement. Police would move if the case smelled like criminality. They would move faster if the press was already hungry, but they would move more surely if someone on the inside spoke up. Sue looked at Ruth's brittle smile in her mind and remembered the slow way her mother had started to whisper about being watched, about phone calls that died mid-sentence. Ruth's letters were in a box, but letters could be accused of being sentimental forgeries. The key was small, but keys open things. That image, Mother's voice muffled behind a door, would not let her go. "Call Detective Huang," Clara said with the kind of practical decisiveness that had made her an asset. "We need someone who will take a domestic harassment claim seriously and who doesn't get starstruck by family names." Detective Huang was a woman whose hands had the way of someone who kept paperwork as a ritual of fairness. She listened to the facts, then asked a single question that knocked the planning into motion. "Has anyone seen Ruth in the last 3 months in public?" Ruth had retreated into quieter spaces of late. No one could answer yes. "Then I need to see the photo chain you have and the key," Huang said. "If there's any possibility she's being held, we'll take it to a magistrate." They moved quickly. Clara filed an affidavit that threaded the events together. Suspicious billing for the gala, the photo of the ring, the warehouse man's statement, the misfiled hospital records, the night manager's testimony about the swapped pan. The magistrate read it with the formal curiosity of someone encountering a pattern made visible in ink. Within 24 hours, a judge signed a search warrant. Sue did not sleep the night before the search. She sat at her kitchen table with the key between her palms like a talisman and thought of how small things sometimes unmade whole sagas. She thought of the broth her mother used to make, simple, restorative, and of the crock she rinsed in the dark out of habit. She thought of the ring on Yaman's finger and the way the city had turned it into an accusation she could neither dissolve nor fully pin down. When Detective Huang's team arrived at the Shin estate, the exterior was a demonstration. Iron gates, a long driveway, and a line of azaleas clipped into military precision. Mrs. Shin watched from a window with a mask of civility and happened, inconveniently, to be hosting friends. Her hands folded around a teacup like a person who had practiced calm until it became a second skin. The legal proceedings were deliberate. The team presented the warrant, the judge's authorization, and the list of rooms to be searched. Inside, servants fidgeted into uniforms that looked like defense. Security cameras recorded the prod and push of uniforms. No dramatic scenes. The law moves with a bureaucratic dignity that denies the cinema of force. They went to the basement because the original call had suggested hidden rooms and because the warehouse photograph had shown shadowed stairs. The door to the lower level gave the impression of storage, a place where the family's holiday decorations might sleep through years. The lock turned on the key Sue had carried in her pocket all morning. For a moment, nothing happened but a deeper silence. Then the door opened and the smell, old air, dust, an odd sweetness of neglected linen, hit Sue in a way that made her stomach hollow. Ruth was there, seated on a chair by a small cot, wrapped in a shawl. She looked smaller than Sue expected, and larger than the rumors suggested, tangible and sharp and alive. "Ruth," Sue said. The name shaped itself like a relief and a prayer. Her mother's eyes opened and registered Sue with the slow joy of someone who had been kept from daylight for too long. "Child," Ruth whispered. The word had the fatigue of someone who had been patient for too long. She reached out in a way that invited neither pity nor dramatics, an honest hand. Sue went to her, and in the embrace found the small, fierce heat she remembered. Detective Huang's officers moved carefully to document the scene before transporting Ruth to the hospital for evaluation. They spoke to servants, who at first offered rehearsed statements, then flinched as a steward remembered a discrepancy in travel logs. A ledger fell open to a page where a travel itinerary had a line redacted, and in the margin, a name had been scrubbed out with such care it read like a confession. Ruth's testimony unfolded later, in the careful space of a police office, with lawyers and a recorder clicking like a chorus. She spoke in patches. Months she had been told she needed rest, a neighbor who would check in, a relative who offered to help. She spoke of nights when a door was locked and a radio kept watch, of being told that the city was safer if she remained in quiet. She did not use the language of conspiracy. She used the language of an elderly woman who had been convinced that surrender was the only way to keep harm away from those she loved. "They told me it was for the family," Ruth said. "That was the excuse they used. They said I was too frail to remember things properly. They gave me a television that played old programs and told me to rest." Her voice trembled on the last word. Ruth's evidence was messy. Memory is messy, but the layer of paper the Shins had used to cloak the act began to shred under scrutiny. The ledger pages, the photographed ring exchanges, the temp's testimony, these threads braided into something a magistrate could see for what it was, a campaign of containment. News of Ruth's rescue spread in a way a thing with color and human texture often does. Photographers snapped images of Ruth leaving the estate wrapped in a blanket and flanked by detectives. The picture of Sue walking toward her mother, a clenched jaw softened by tears, reframed the narrative in a way gossip rarely lets itself. The public, always fickle, found a new take. The scandal's casualty had been silenced. Now the question was who had silenced her, and why? The Shin return strategy was immediate. Mina issued statements that emphasized propriety and the family's right to private care for an aging parent. Mrs. Shin wrote an op-ed about the cruelty of tabloids. Yamin posted herself at a charity ribbon cutting, smiling the kind of smile that is practiced for cameras. But this time, there was a leak in a part of the dam that the Shins had never properly considered. A small bank transfer, in the name of the event logistics firm the team had traced to an offshore account. Clara, practically ravenous with the kind of zeal that comes from a lawyer who believes in justice, had subpoenaed banking records, pushed the right buttons, and unearthed coordinated payments timed with the gala. She delivered the documents to the police and to a journalist she trusted. The journalist, a woman who had once interviewed Sue for a profile about young women in medicine, smelled an undeniable story. Money, image manipulation, an elderly woman hidden away. It had all the pieces that made the front pages. But courtrooms do not move only on outrage. They move on proof. That's why the next stage of Sue's campaign had to be surgical. She needed to show how the public spectacle, the ring on Yaman's finger, had been the hinge for a ledger that reallocated wealth. She needed not only to rescue her mother and show the physical proof of confinement, but to demonstrate that the Shins had orchestrated paperwork to sever Sue's claims and redirect the estate's holdings. In a small conference room, Dr. Dean and Clara aligned their findings. A forgery analysis of a will, signatures that did not match Ruth's hand in the original envelope Sue had kept in the box, a chain of payments from the hospitality firm whose contract had rearranged the Shin estate in the months after the car crash, and CCTV that placed the suited man, now identified as a consultant the Shins relied on, near the coat check her team had tracked. Clara moved pieces on a board like a chess player. If we can show that the estate's transfer coincided with the moment the photo made you look unstable, we can argue the motive. If we can show that the will was forged and that payments were made to secure temporary witnesses and staff at the gala, we may have a civil fraud case and a criminal referral. "You will need witnesses who will speak in court," Detective Huang said. "The warehouse man, the coat check staff, May, everyone who touched the chain of events has to be willing to tell the same story under oath." The plan required courage. Witnesses feared the Shin reach. They worried about livelihoods and threats that never had to be explicit to do damage. So Sue leaned on the network she had built, the loyalty of people she had treated as a doctor, the unemployed temp who had been frightened in a warehouse, May who had risked losing her catering contracts. She spoke with each of them about the law, about courage and consequence, and found that shame and fear, when held in the light, often created a kind of freedom. The next move was public, a press conference that would not be a spectacle of triumph, but a strategic unveiling. Clara arranged for a small set of cameras, legal counsel, and a sympathetic journalist to be present. Dr. Dean would present the medical anomalies. Detective Huang would explain the criminal investigation into unlawful confinement. Sue would stand and read the facts with the calm fury of someone who had been wronged and who had decided to fight within the frame the law provided. When they stepped outside into the press cluster, the wind caught Sue's hair and made it look like a banner. The cameras were hungry, but Sue kept her face concentrated, not theatrical. She spoke for Ruth first, then for the facts. She did not shout. She delivered documents. She showed the key with the Shen crest and explained how it had fit a lock that kept a woman away from her family. The journalist who had once profiled her nodded with a kind of bittersweet patience. The effect was immediate. The narrative that had been only a picture suddenly had a body. The city's sympathy shifted toward the woman who had endured humiliation and had been silenced. Public outrage is a soft power until it becomes a legal lever. Then it has teeth. The Shens moved to limit the damage. Mina threatened litigation, summoned PR teams that spun stories about eldercare and private life. But the legal engine Sue had engaged was not easily diverted by spin. Mina's threats looked thin in the face of documented ledger entries and bank transfers that could be traced. The judge who had signed the search warrant permitted the police to pursue charges. A criminal inquiry into the elder confinement and into possible fraud gained momentum. At the same time, Sue was not content with moral victory alone. She needed structural power. She needed control of the story that would determine who would sit at the tables where decisions were made. The imperative to become a CEO, to wear the CEO's ring the next morning, required more than courtroom vindication. It required a strategic shift that turned the Shen's weapon, public optics, back into a liability. She had found, in Ruth's letters, a note she'd ignored as sentimental. An old memorandum from a decade ago, scribbled in Ruth's hand, that indicated an interest in a hospitality subsidiary, a small chain of restaurants and hotels that had once been part of the Shen holdings. The subsidiary had been operating at a loss, easily dismissed or sold off to shadow companies if the Shens wanted it gone. But Ruth's handwriting suggested an intent to preserve the subsidiary for the family's charitable arm, with Sue named as an advisor in the original plan. The page had been buried in a box and watered down in official filing rooms by documents that favored new hands. Clara's legal eye saw a path. If the original intent could be authenticated, and if the existing transfer of assets to offshore accounts could be proven as fraud, then the court could freeze those assets. If assets were frozen, the company's board would be in flux. If the board was in flux, and if a trusted investor recognized an opportunity, Sue could step into a leadership role either temporarily or by negotiation. The investor came unexpectedly. Chef Liang, the chef owner of a cluster of neighborhood restaurants who had watched Sue's small acts of kindness in the past, donations of catering for a clinic fundraiser, lending an ear during a staff emergency, called to offer capital. He did not pretend to be wealthy enough to buy a fortune. He offered the one thing Clara needed to make noise, a public commitment to acquire a significant minority stake in the hospitality arm on the condition that management be restructured and transparency be established. His money was not the kind that could buy a company outright, but it served as the oxygen that let a legal bottleneck become a market problem for the Shens. Clara leveraged Chef Liang's offer into a strategic demand. A shareholder proposal, filed in the shadow of the criminal investigation, to place an independent director on the hospitality subsidiary's board and to demand an emergency audit. The motion would go to a vote and the public was watching. With the assets frozen and a vote coming, the Shens faced a choice. Enter a long public legal brawl with all its reputational cost, or negotiate. They chose negotiation because wealth often prefers quiet settlements. The settlement, however, had the shape of a contract Sue could live with, an agreement that the hospitality subsidiary's board would put its operations under interim management pending investigation, that a forensic audit would be conducted, and that Ruth's mental and physical capacity be assessed to determine the legitimacy of the contested documents. In a terse meeting with Mina and a board of directors that had grown used to deflecting crises with gentle smiles, Sue negotiated terms that allowed her to be appointed interim CEO of the hospitality subsidiary while the audit proceeded. It was not a complete victory. The Shens retained the majority and could fight in court for months. But it was enough. A seat at a table, control of a ledger, a legal anchor from which to steer the story toward a cleaner daylight. When she accepted the interim role, Sue did not imagine a coronation. She imagined spreadsheets and supply chains, staff meetings, and the practicalities of keeping a kitchen open. But she also imagined the ring. The CEO's ring she would be offered, not a gaudy symbol but a company token, a heavy band stamped with the crest of the subsidiary, would be her visible claim to place and power. She would wear it in the morning like a reversal and a reminder. That night, Ruth slept in a hospital bed with walls that smelled of antiseptic and kindness. Sue sat beside her and held her hand with the same steadiness she had offered patience for years. Ruth's eyes fluttered open in the small hours and she murmured, "You've always been stubborn?" "So have you," Sue replied. She did not mention the ring. She mentioned instead how her mother's hands had once taught her to be patient with broth and with people. In the loose days between legal filings and press statements, they built evidence. Detective Huang interviewed staff and recovered security footage from a street camera that caught the suited man guiding Ting across the floor at the gala. The warehouse man agreed to testify as long as his identity was protected by a witness program. May provided the catering invoices and the disposable pan that could be traced back to a supplier who had logged the wrong SKU. Dr. Isas Dean provided a careful analysis of the misfiled hospital records and an expert report that suggested the possibility of tampering. The forensic accountant Clara retained traced funds through several shell companies and found a trail that led to vendors favored by the Shins. The path had been obscured by layers of corporate paper, but the pattern, payments to a consultancy, transfers to an offshore entity, then to temp agencies, recurred like a refrain. Where the Shins had hoped to make confusion, they had left the breadcrumbs of human fallibility. A signature here, a memo there, a server log overlooked. "You've made them sloppy with their success," Clara told Sue one evening in a courthouse coffee shop. They never expected a woman who knows charts and kitchens to start following them. There were prices to pay. The Shins responded in public media with a polished strategy of their own. Mrs. Shin called a press luncheon to announce philanthropic initiatives and to publicly pity the tabloids that had pulled a family through gossip. Yamin engaged in interviews that sounded rehearsed. The social press tried to salvage images and run counter-narratives. It was all noise designed to dampen the facts Sue and her small army were assembling. Sue felt herself stretched between urgent legal work and the everyday demands of becoming a public figure. Donors called to ask if she would step away from the public eye. Old colleagues reached out with cautious support. In the middle of it all, Ting remained in a hospital bed, appearances thin, reality complex. He had been declared stable but unconscious at first. As the days slid forward, he did not remain silent forever. His awakening was small and unannounced. A nurse in the ICU noticed him moving his fingers and called for a neurologist. The monitors, which had been a quiet, indifferent chorus, found a new rhythm. When he opened his eyes, he looked bewildered rather than theatrical, as if invited into a world with a head that was not yet fully his. Sue arrived at the hospital before the news could be broadcast, and found herself outside the ICU with her heart in her throat. Seeing him awake was an odd private thing amid the spinning public. He saw her, and for a moment everything bristled with the ache of their last moments in public and the absence of everything in between. "Ting," she said. His name was small and heavy. She did not reach for an apology. That would be performance. He tried to form words and found them clumsy with sleep and disorientation. When he spoke, his voice carried an impression of someone trying to anchor memory in a sea of suggestion. "I don't remember," he began. He stopped, wrestling with a fog. Dr. Dean, present as both friend and clinician, explained gently how trauma could separate recollection from action. "It doesn't mean he didn't act," he said, "but it might mean he wasn't the author of all the choices we saw on camera." Ting listened as if the words were instructions for a body that needed to learn steps. At a certain point, his eyes cleared enough to ask, "Why did I put the ring on her?" The question, simple and raw, opened a space. Sue did not have to answer it for him. The police and the auditors would parse motives, but the moment demanded moral clarity. She could have used his awakening as a rotten excuse for emotional blackmail. She refused. Instead, she said, "You were on a stage. People put people on stages all the time and tell them to make scenes. If you were asked to do something, we have to understand who asked you." He looked at her with the kind of bewildered compassion that can exist only when someone is waking to their own smallness. "Someone told me," he confessed, "something about how a picture would make things clear. I thought showing what I wanted would help. I didn't know they were planning to make someone hurt. His guilt was a thing she did not need to harvest for theatrics. It was real and messy. Sue listened. She let him confess in the small, non-judging space that had become hospital rooms for her, a place where people could unravel without public clamor. "You were used," she said softly, "not by him alone, by a plan." Ting's recovery was not linear. Memory is a treacherous map. But fragments collected. He began to remember meetings where an advisor had suggested optics and where the idea of a staged betrayal had been presented as a tool to consolidate sympathy for a takeover. He remembered a man with a gray suit who took pride in arranging scenes that controlled the camera. Detective Huang's investigation found the gray-suited consultant in a meeting log. The man tried to invoke privilege and professional distance, but his fingerprints were in contracts, and he had a pattern of inserting himself where reputation could be curated. Under pressure, a witness from the events firm, too frightened at first to speak, signed a statement that detailed the coordination. The disposable pan that looked like a switch, the ring in a velvet box handed at the right moment, a note to guide Ting onto the stage at a precise second. The public reaction to the unraveling was a temperate fury. Outrage, sadly, is an efficient fuel for investigation. The more the Shins pushed back with their PR, the more readers dug into the records and found the ledger that did not quite add up. The forensic auditor's report, which Clara released as part of the legal strategy, detailed how funds had moved, how contracts had been misrepresented, and how a succession of small manipulations had created a narrative convenient to the Shins. With the audit published and criminal inquiries underway, corporate pressure mounted. Sponsors and donors began to distance themselves from the Shins' philanthropic umbrella. The hospitality subsidiaries board, facing an injunction and the threat of a criminal investigation, convened an emergency session. The motion to install Sue as interim CEO was not a simple matter of grace. It was a pragmatic solution to keep a business alive while the scandal was contained. The day she signed the interim papers, Sue did not feel like a victor. The signature felt like responsibility inked onto a body. Her first acts were the practical things that make a business hum. Check payroll, ensure staff are paid, keep suppliers on schedule. She held meetings with managers whose faces were tired but grateful. She found herself listening to a line cook explain the cost of rice with the patience of someone who had spent years listening to pulse rates. And yet she knew the ring awaited. The company presented the CEO ring at a small internal ceremony. It was not a glittering jewel, but a weighty band engraved with the subsidiary's crest. It had the minimalism of a tool, not a trophy. When Sue slid it onto her finger, the metal felt cool and unfamiliar. Cameras were present, but the moment was tempered by quiet pride rather than vindictive display. The symbolism was clean. A woman who had been made small now wore a band that represented stewardship, not conquest. She wore the ring the next morning into a room that held the city's press, a board of directors with forced smiles, and Ting sitting in a chair watching from the periphery. The world braced for a scene. In a society used to sharp public humiliation, the sight of Sue, composed, practical, and wearing the CEO's ring, was disarming. It shifted the optics from spectacle to authority. Her public reveal was not a shout, it was a demonstration. She walked into the press conference, the light catching on the band at her finger. Cameras clicked. A hush swallowed the room. She spoke plainly, naming evidence, offering the facts the auditors had compiled, the forged signature, the offshore transfers, the testimonies of temps and staff, the ledger changes that coincided with the gala and earlier car crash documents. Detective Huang spoke of the criminal referral for unlawful confinement and the witness statements that placed the consultant and certain board members at the center of a conspiracy of influence. Dr. Dean presented the medical discrepancies. Ting, fragile but lucid, offered a statement. He had been guided, he had not known the full scope, and he regretted the pain he had caused. There was no theatrical gloating. Sue did not raise her voice to demand punishment. She asked for justice and clarity. The city's appetite for retribution was satiated by the neatness of the documents. Newsrooms produced timelines and diagrams that laid the conspiracy out for readers who wanted cause and effect. Where before the story had been a single photograph, now it was a layered forensic narrative. Yamin, who had enjoyed the short-lived warmth of notoriety, found herself reduced by the same mechanisms she had once used. Under interrogation, her account frayed. She claimed the ring had been placed as an amorous gesture, that she had not known of any larger plan. Her testimony, inconsistent and defensive, made her look like a woman who had climbed by imitating the language of entitlement. Public sentiment turned quicker than the tides. Mrs. Shen, elegant and formidable, found her carefully curated world ringed by legal notices and calls from donors who considered distance better for their brands. Mina, the lawyer, had to answer uncomfortable questions about her involvement, and while she defended herself with practiced calm, the court of public opinion had a shorthand. The family that had orchestrated a deception was being exposed. The legal consequences unfolded over months in measured movement. Charges filed, civil suits initiated, settlements negotiated. Some members of the Shin circle faced indictments, others found themselves under scrutiny and on the defensive. The company's senior board members resigned or were removed. The hospitality subsidiary survived the scandal with its staff largely intact, a product of Sue's insistence that the workers not be the collateral damage. At home, Sue and Ruth rebuilt private life in small, stubborn ways. They ate soup that Ruth herself made, the broth clear and honest, the spoon a ritual returned. Ruth's physical recovery was slow but steady. Her testimony in court had been a small, brave thing for which Sue was quietly proud. Ting's path was more complicated. He struggled with guilt and with the reality of being a public figure who had been manipulated. He attended counseling and met with legal authorities as a witness. For a time, he retreated from public life, but he did not disappear. He met Sue in a careful exchange, no dramatic romance, but an honest human reckoning. He apologized more than once in small notes and gestures. Sue accepted apologies not as a way back into a past she did not want to return to, but as a recognition of the complexity of human weakness. The Shin's fall was neither a simple moral tidy-up nor an irrecoverable wreck. They lost influence. Some assets were redistributed. Some members of the legal team faced disciplinary action. There were settlements and ongoing litigation, but the public had already moved into a new moral posture. They saw the woman who had been humiliated become the woman who held a ring of office. The more intimate triumphs were quieter. May's catering business saw a surge of loyal customers who admired her courage. Hung, whose loyalty had always been a steady, unannounced force, accepted a formal offer to head security for the hospitality subsidiary. Dr. Dean was named head of a new health initiative for the company's staff. Clara, who had worked herself into the ground chasing documents and preparing affidavits, became Sue's counsel and a close friend. The team arranged a modest celebration in the restaurant where they had met, not to feign vengeance, but to mark survival and steadiness. The final public scene, the one that would be replayed in clips and in the way stories take shape, came at a shareholders' meeting in the hospitality subsidiary's boardroom. Cameras crowded the hall, but the tone had shifted from ready-to-burn theater to sober accountability. The meeting's agenda included a full reading of the audit, votes on the removal of certain directors, and the election of interim leadership. Sue entered the boardroom calm and deliberate, her CEO's ring shining but not ostentatious. She spoke not as a woman governing by anger, but as one governing by duty. She laid out a plan for the subsidiary's immediate future, an open audit, better worker protections, transparent procurement policies, and a sponsorship program that would restore community trust. Her language was practical, her authority unquestioned in that room, not because of spectacle, but because she had walked the long corridor of evidence to get there. At the end of the meeting, there was a moment that had the simplicity of a metaphor realized. The man who had put the ring on another woman's finger, the man whose action had been the lit fuse of her humiliation, sat quietly as directors, newly elected and accountable, called for reform. He had been humbled by events not entirely in his control. For some viewers, the image of him looking small in a room that had once been his playground was enough. Sue did not gloat over him. She had no need. Her victory was not revenge, but restoration and responsibility. She left the building with Ruth at her side, Hung walking a step behind, and May bustling in front with plans for a new catering contract. The world that had once assumed her place had been rearranged, but Sue's center had changed less in its core than it had in its possibility. She had the power to shape things, to make sustainability and dignity her currency. In the months that followed, the subsidiary stabilized. Lawsuits continued, some settled, others dissolved into procedural dust. The consultant with the gray suit faced charges and a public fall. Yaman's social climb evaporated as sponsors cut ties. Mrs. Shen retreated to a quieter life, exchanging public pronouncements for private ones. Ruth, who had been a reluctant star in the media's gaze for a time, found solace in a return to a kitchen where spoons and broth reigned. On a bright morning months after the gala, Sue stood at a window in the subsidiary's modest executive suite and held a cup of tea the way one might hold a thought. The CEO's ring glinted at her finger, heavy with meaning she had earned through late nights and cross-examinations, through small acts of care and big acts of courage. She thought of rings, the cold metal that had once cut her reflection into shards, the ring placed on the wrong finger that had been a public act meant to shame. She thought, too, of the ring on her hand now, the same shape perhaps, but filled with stewardship, an obligation to feed and to keep the place honest. Ruth came in with a pot of broth and set it on the counter like a small blessing. "You look tired," she said simply. "I'm tired," Sue answered, "but not in the way I was. I'm tired the way a person is who has fought and is ready to do the work." Ruth smiled. "You always knew how to fix things, at least the parts you could touch," she said. "Now you have a place to touch many parts." They ate soup at a small table, spoons clinking, the sound a domestic coda to months of public noise. Around them, business calls came and went. A manager asked about new supplier contracts. A staffer texted about a kitchen upgrade. The life of leadership, Sue knew, was full of meetings and modest acts that over time shape institutions. There were personal reconciliations and quiet losses. Ting and Sue talked sometimes across the table like people forging a truce that might become friendship. He volunteered at a local rehabilitation center, trying to match penance with service. Some members of the Shin clan apologized in private and offered resources for the subsidiary's community programs. Others negotiated settlements that left bitter tastes. The law had not healed everything, but it had created a space where claims could be heard. At the end of the day, Sue stood on the little balcony that overlooked the city square, the ring on her finger catching the light like a promise. She did not think of retribution, she thought of duty. She had been publicly humiliated, then privately betrayed, then forced to build from ruin. She had done so with the help of people who had offered small, often costly loyalties. The story that began with a ring slid onto the wrong finger had ended, in public at least, with a woman who wore a ring that meant different things. It was not vengeance so much as a reclamation of dignity, of agency, and of the willingness to transform harm into a mandate for care. In the quiet before the evening's light faded, Ruth pressed Sue's hand with a small, fierce grip. "You did what I could not," she said. Sue looked at the band on her finger, then at her mother, then out into the city that had watched and judged, and finally, in many small ways, seen what had been hidden. "We did it," she said. "We kept the truth." Outside, lamps came alive. A child laughed at a passing dog. The ordinary songs of the city returned to their rhythms. Sue slipped the ring, heavy and honest, a little higher on her finger, as if to remind herself of the work ahead. It was, she understood, not an end, but a beginning. If you want to see more stories of people who turn disgrace into dignity, subscribe and follow the next chapter of Lives That Choose to Rebuild.